2020 was written by the same person who wrote the Game of Thrones series finale.
Oh, 3 in the morning.
Man coming out the grocery cart.
I know what you're thinking. What the fekete was that guy smoking? Welcome once again to another episode of Wha Yuh Go Do. So much has happened since I last spoke to you, it just isn't possible to cover it all here. Well, first thing, we are being released back into the wild. The government scrambled the jets to protect us against Trini invaders, and apparently one way to make soya chunks more appealing to the palate is with a generous sprinkling of cocaine. It's all too much to explore, really. The best I can do is count through the lowlights. The trajectory of COVID-19 around the world is still troubling. Slowly, though, several countries are emerging from lockdown. Restrictions are being eased incrementally. We've been doing the same here in TNT. It's back to regular work, or what we consider work in this country anyway. The Prime Minister announced on a Saturday that for many of us, it was back to work on Monday. That wasn't a lot of notice. Fellas, without access to a barber, your fades faded and your mark had gone to pasture. Back in March, you looked like this. You came out in June looking like this. Women folk had it tough too. 2 months and change without the mystical time reversal powers of your hairdresser is quite the sacrifice. It was a lot of roots, reality and culture when some ladies finally got to see the light of day. Pharmacies were probably selling more home hair color kits than pickled onion condoms. Pickled onion condoms! Who knew there was a market for sex that tastes like Pringles for drunk people? Anyway, a few greys or a few million greys is a small price to pay for keeping a pandemic at bay. For now, it's back on the chain gang. I couldn't believe so many people were chomping at the bit to get back to work. That just feels like a drunk driver pulling over and volunteering for a breathalyzer. In fact, some people were even more eager than others to get back on the job.
What going on, I tell you? It's 3 a.m. and all the cutting grass? Now, I have to find somewhere else to cut, boy. Not here, boy. My child sleeping inside, boy. I have to find somewhere else to cut grass, boy. That's here 3 in the morning. I am calling the police.
How very industrious, working the grass and the frazzled wits of people who have crazy ideas about sleeping at night and all this. Who needs a noisy cock on a fence when you have a tag team of Whack-A-Man and Leaf Blower Man to put a pep in your early morning step? You want more than 6 hours sleep? What do you think this is, a nursing home? With so much time in lockdown, people weren't just keen to get back on the job or gas up the whacker. You see, many businesses suffered irreparable harm. Revenues had to be kickstarted again somehow. Pivot became the catchphrase of the business sector. When one door is closed, another is opened and all that claptrap. Now, car sales ain't nothing new, but people had to look for any way to replace lost income. Like this guy. Take a close look at this Facebook advert. Blow it up, selector. There is more going on in this picture than your average bar fight. Examine, if you will, the text. The seller is asking for 2 forms of ID, proof of address, and read it with me, city fekete. Certificate. A certificate of good character. I got so caught up in that word, I nearly missed his asking price. A used Nissan Almera at just under $3 million is a bargain on any day. I know what you're thinking. What the fekete was that guy smoking? Well, he did quote his price in TT dollars, so there's that. Look, I don't give him wrong. You really have to get your hustle on in this post-lockdown economic meltdown. Try to get some semblance of control back over your life. It's tough to live with that sickening feeling of having no control. That's certainly how many of us feel, knowing that every day there are hordes of people trying to invade this country. In these perilous times, it's at least mildly comforting to know that standing between us and oblivion is a government that will stand up and say to hell with policy and common decency and common sense. We must protect our citizens in this pandemic and keep our citizens locked out of their own country indefinitely. For all the Trinis who got caught outside the borders, it must feel odd, even hurtful, to be cast in the role of villain, simply for getting on a plane or a cruise ship and leaving the country before the borders closed. And the things people were saying online about Trinis stranded abroad were really beyond belief. You would think these Trinis were Venezuelans or something. To hear language like this, they can't be allowed to run riot here. That's got to feel like a kick in the dirty bits, particularly coming not from some crusty curmudgeon on the street who's had a microphone stuck in his face by a reporter. Those words came from no less a person, and yet a lesser person, than the Prime Minister himself. Now, the Swiss Army Minister Stuart Young has asked these Trinis stuck in other countries to hold strain and shelter in place. A curious choice of words. As it happens, many of them have no choice but to shelter at homeless shelters as their funds and the goodwill of friends and relatives abroad have been exhausted. But what you gonna do? The system of approvals for exemptions to return to this country seem more random than the roulette machine in the corner of the happy eating people Chinese restaurant. The consequences for our people who are left high and dry in other countries seems lost on citizens here at home who seem quite comfortable rubbishing their fellow Trinis as irresponsible. Yes, irresponsible for leaving this country to look for work because the local economy is in terminal decline. Traveling abroad to get healthcare because our health system is such that if you get the slightest fever, a touch of the ague, you could end up in the morgue. No folks, not everyone abroad was traveling on a bucket list trip of a lifetime. Still, it's really best to keep them out of the country for now. If they're allowed to come back, they will spread a disease to their families more deadly than COVID-19, PNMitis. We can't let that get into the population before an election. Incidentally, many of our citizens will have been caught up in the twin perils of the pandemic and surging unrest in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. Man, 2020 is really living its best life, isn't it? What's next? A plague of locusts?
Already we are living in a complicated life, but now locusts and COVID-19, they are now bringing new problems.
Wait, we had the plague of locusts already? As someone suggested online, 2020 was written by the same person who wrote the Game of Thrones series finale. And whoever is writing is fed up of this series called Humanity and wants it over and fast. But back to the tragedy of George Floyd and the live, die, repeat cyclical reality of police killings of Black Americans. This textbook case of police brutality reignited the Black Lives Matter movement and flashed over to rioting, looting, and general conflagration. Forget pandemic, this outrage ain't waiting for no vaccine. How could it? Here at home, many people try to draw parallels between the institutionalized racism and discrimination against Black people in the US and the experiences of our Afro-Trini population. That is comparing apples and pomsite. Eric Williams became the Prime Minister of this country in 1962 when Black Americans were still drinking from colored water fountains and getting mauled by German shepherds in the streets. So let's take it easy on the parallels. It's perfectly fine to express solidarity with BLM in the United States. Addressing our own race issues, though, requires a bit more introspection. Our race relations are completely different from the American experience and the historical background than I have time to explain. It is important, though, to touch on our turbulent ethnic divisions in TNT. How we see ourselves is a useful conversation to have, even if the maturity to have that conversation is as rare as a pleasant customer experience in this country. Each racial grouping lays claim to being discriminated against and having no part in racial prejudice themselves. This equation, of course, is a failed proposition because if that were true, we would be the very picture of racial harmony, a beacon to the world. We invest a lot of energy in weighing up who is more racist than whom. That's like making a distinction between a gun with 9 bullets and one with 20. In Rainbow Country, we all harbor racial bias and in some cases outright prejudice. Tell me if any of this sounds familiar. All Indians are drunkards and thieves, all African is bandit or lazy, Chinese like to eat dog, the 1% which includes the Syrian and the white man does only exploit the poor man and all of them running guns and drugs. All Venezuelans are prostitutes, all red men are sexy and beguiling. Words like that are hurtful. The only time we unite as races is when we come together as a people to condemn other people like Venezuelans or the 1%. In Trinidad and Tobago, our people are at once the single greatest asset and the most damning curse. Our varied backgrounds and cultural differences are exactly what make this country unique in the Caribbean. Yet we're happy to let politicians inflame primordial racist attitudes, mistrust, misunderstandings, because we are unhappy with the state of affairs and need to find someone to blame. It's like the man said, Trinidad and Tobago would be the most beautiful place on earth were it not for the people. But what you gonna do?